And for those of you who don't know me, I think everybody does. I'm Bob Schmidt, Executive Director of the Brandis Center here at UC San Diego's Rady School of Management. I'll start today's event the way I typically do, with a very sincere thank you to each of you for joining us today. We're going to talk about two related topics, U.S. government debt and U.S. monetary policy. And to help us navigate those topics, we'll turn to our guest speakers, Mark Higgins and Advisory Board member Jim Brown. I'll introduce them in more detail in a few moments. We've set aside just a couple of things. We've set aside 2 hours for today. May not need all of that time, but again, we are recording. So if you have to bow out at some point during the session, that's fine. We'll send around the recording, hopefully later this week. And it looks like everybody's already done this. If you haven't done so already, please put yourselves on mute. I'd love to eliminate any background noise, really give the floor to our guest speakers. And every time I say that, I say at the same time, please, please, please be prepared to unmute yourselves and ask questions, share comments. Y'all are really good at that. I want to make this as interactive a discussion as possible. So I want to start our introductions with Mark Higgins. He's an author, historian, and investment industry practitioner, serves as Senior Vice President for IFA Institutional, providing advisory services to institutional asset owners and select high net worth individuals. Mark is also the author of the book, I'll hold it up here, Investing in U.S. Financial History, Understanding the Past to Forecast the Future. His book spans everything from Alexander Hamilton, no, we're not talking about the musical, we're talking about the guy, ends with the Fed's ongoing battle with inflation. And I think both of our guest speakers will have some thoughts on inflation today. In March last year, his book won a bronze medal in the prestigious Axiom Book Awards. Now, Mark is also a member of the editorial board of the Museum of American Finance and is a frequent writer for the museum's Financial History magazine. And if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to visit moaf.org. They've got current and back issues there. It's just a wealth of historical information that always surprises me, kind of like Mark's book has practical relevance for today. A couple other things reflecting on the quality of Mark's work. Journalists from CNBC, the Wall Street Journal, and Morningstar, and many others have quoted his work. And honestly, I thought of Mark, got introduced to him through the Gabelli Center at Fordham University. And I've mentioned this, the Brandis Center is now one of maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 other value investing centers across North America. I heard Mark speak in a forum very similar to this last year, and I asked a question during his session about government debt. And at the time I was thinking, hey, how can we get this guy to present at a Brandis Center advisory board meeting? So Mark graduated from Georgetown University, Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in English and psychology, earned an MBA from the Darden School at the University of Virginia, and is a CFA charter holder and CFP professional. So Mark, thanks very much for joining us. I want to introduce Jim Brown as well. He's been a longstanding Brandis Center advisory board member. We used to work together at Brandis, the firm, for over 20 years. At Brandis, Jim was partner and voting member of various investment committees, also as a senior analyst covering utilities and financial institutions. And I'm guessing his work in the latter influenced his work with his book. He's also served as president of the Ayn Rand Institute, CEO of the Prometheus Foundation, and a board member for Monetary Metals and Company. For the past 4 years, he's been writing on Substack as Hard Money Jim, so you might want to check him out there. And last year, Jim mentioned that he had written a book called A Black Hole in Economics, Money Creation and Its Consequences. I downloaded the digital version, so holding up my iPad here. And Jim, I mean this as a sincere compliment. I was surprised at how good it is. Monetary policy, I thought, okay, how interesting could this be? And from your opening chapter, I couldn't put it down. And getting about halfway through, then I thought, okay, wouldn't it be really cool if we could get not only Mark, but Jim to co-host a call and talk about monetary policy and debt. So I'm thrilled to have both of you here today. Just a couple other points about Jim. Like Mark, he's a CFA charter holder. His book was named Book of the Month recently by the website capitalism.org. He earned his BS from the U.S. Air Force Academy. He was also a pilot flight instructor, flight commander, and squadron leader, and earned his MBA from Harvard Business School. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. So again, I've kind of set the table, but getting into a little bit more of the details, I'll ask Mark to kick us off, talk for about 20 minutes or so. Then I'll turn things over to Jim. When they're both done, we'll open it up more formally to Q&A. But as I mentioned earlier, if at any point you have a question, take yourselves off mute, raise your hand, shout out. Again, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So with that, Mark, thanks again. I'll turn things over to you, my friend.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Bob. That was very thorough. And, the funny thing is, you mentioned a lot of academic things that I did, and I mean this sincerely. By far, the most valuable thing that I've done, it's not even close, was the research I did for this book over the past 4 years. It's just, when COVID hit, I was looking to history to figure out if there's any precedent, and I feel like I just stumbled on a gold mine. I mean, nobody looks at this stuff, and there's so much from the past that can inform the present. And we were talking about this before we started. When you look at things like in a time-lapsed way over the past couple hundred years, you see trends that are obvious that just no one pays attention to because they're so focused on the present. So, but thank you for the introduction. So, what we're going to talk about today is just the historical perspective on the use of the public credit of the United States of America, which is clearly a big deal today. After what happened with COVID, it kind of brought it to the forefront a little earlier than we anticipated, but it was eventually going to come. I'll skip over my bio since we went through that. So when I give presentations like this, I like to start with this quote from Alexander Hamilton. In August, really the summer of 1782, the Revolutionary War was not going well. The colonies were absolutely devastated economically, and human misery was widespread. And Robert Morris, who was the superintendent of finance, sent a bunch of lieutenants to the 13 colonies to assess the conditions. And Alexander Hamilton kind of feared that, everyone's going to sugarcoat. It's so bad. People are going to sugarcoat the message. But he decided to report things exactly as they are. And he said in his letter, and you can get this online, "You will perceive, sir, I have neither flattered the state nor encouraged high expectations. I have thought it my duty to exhibit things as they are, not as they ought to be." And, we may not be a war-torn country right now, but we have a pretty unpleasant reality with the public debt and how the public credit has been used. And, the unpleasant realities from my perspective, looking at history, is that the U.S. treatment of the public credit is very inconsistent with two Hamiltonian principles that were established in 1790. They abandoned these principles after World War II because essentially Americans had just tremendous wealth and we became emboldened by it. Nobody wants to talk about it, but the unsustainable spending is driven by Social Security and healthcare entitlements. There's kind of temptation to think that the reserve currency of the United States is permanent. It's long lasting. They don't change very often, but it's not permanent. We have had reserve currencies in the past. They do get lost eventually if they're abused. And, from my perspective, the shifting mentality on the use of the public debt, this has been going on so long, it is the biggest challenge for this country. Nobody remembers what it was like before this mentality shifted. And that's what we're going to go into a little today. So we'll start with the principles of Hamilton. The thing that there are, a lot of notable people in U.S. financial history. Nobody has matched Alexander Hamilton. He was absolutely incredible. The guy was the foresight that he had, hundreds of years into the future, was just amazing. But when he repaired the credit in 1790 and put the United States on a firm financial footing, he really had two principles that he recommended to Congress for the use of the public credit. The first was that the public credit should primarily be used in times of what he called public danger. And the second was that when the danger subsided, there should be a mechanism to repay the debt. and prepare for the next one. And I'm going to read the quotes because they're really powerful. On the first principle, he said, exigencies are to be expected to occur in the affairs of nations in which there will be a necessity for borrowing. That loans in times of public danger, especially from foreign war, are found an indispensable resource even to the wealthiest of them. It is essential that the credit of a nation should be well established. Then the second principle, he ardently wishes to see it incorporated as a fundamental maxim in the system of public credit of the United States, that the creation of debt should always be accompanied with the means of extinguishment. This he regards as the true secret for rendering public credit immortal. So we did that for a while. If you look at, it's a little hard to see probably on the screen, but this is the federal deficits or surpluses as a percentage of GDP from 1792 all the way to 2023. And if you start from the left, you can see after the Revolutionary War and after Alexander repaired the credit, you had some surpluses to pay down that debt. War of 1812 hits, we ran big deficits, paid them back. Let me do a little point here. Civil War hits, major deficits, paid them back. World War I hits, major deficits, paid them back. Great Depression and World War II hit, major deficits. Kind of toyed around with paying it back, but really stopped. That's when we really started running chronic fiscal deficits. You had a little anomaly here because of the dot-com, but it was really chronic deficits. And this is the real anomaly. People tend to focus on the fiscal deficits that were run during the GFC and COVID-19, but that's actually more consistent with Hamiltonian principles than just the chronic deficits that put us in a position where this was so costly. We weren't paying it back during times of relative plenty. So that's kind of a quick history on the use of the public debt of the United States. So the question becomes, well, why did this happen? And there's a great quote from Paul Volcker that really captured what happened. He said, the position of the United States after World War II was entirely abnormal and unsustainable. Our industrial power actually strengthened, while our potential competitors were substantially destroyed and needed our help to rebuild themselves. It has been both natural and desirable for others to catch up to us from a very depressed level. And that's really what happened. After World War II, the United States was incredibly wealthy, but it was a very anomalous time. The US possessed 70% of the world's gold, and gold was attached to the US dollar. And then through Bretton Woods, the fixed exchange rate system was, the rest of the world was on the gold standard. We had the biggest thing was not only did we have an intact industrial infrastructure, it was massively expanded because of the arsenal of democracy. We were arming ourselves and our allies, and the rest of the world was destroyed. I mean, Japan, China, Europe was completely in ruins. So we had a tremendous competitive advantage. Then, the US dollar also replaced the pound sterling as the dominant reserve currency under Bretton Woods. And this is something that's not appreciated as, there was a good book by Robert Gordon on productivity trends through history. And we were also in the midst of an incredible productivity boom in really the mid 1900s. So that really helped us outgrow the debt as well. So that's the basic dynamic at a very high level. Want to pause there? Any questions? You want to make it interactive?
Hey, Mark, I'll share one thing. As I mentioned this earlier, I was rereading portions of your book, and if I remember it correctly, the consumer really increased their level of debt as well after World War II.
That's true.
Prior to that, it was almost shunned if you were buying something on credit. Or maybe
that was actually before World War II.
I was going to say this is back in World War I when radios come out and electricity is introduced. So I'm not sure which is which, kind of like art imitating life or vice versa.
Yeah.
Government kind of mirroring what they're seeing at the consumer level, or consumers are mirroring what the government is doing, or they're both kind of happening concurrently.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about that. My perception, it was more just this assumption we had such an advantage, and people tend to project things forward that they probably shouldn't. And I just think there was an assumption that this would, we would always have these advantages and we could afford the spending when we couldn't. That's my gut, but it's hard to capture all of the drivers of an entire generation, really, but multiple generations. I don't know. What do others think? All right, well, we'll keep going on, but feel free to interject with questions. So the other thing that was kind of going on simultaneously, and again, there have been some good, well, it's a different book actually. John Cogan wrote a very good book on the history of entitlements in the United States. It's called The High Cost of Good Intentions. And it really tells the history of pensions and then later broader entitlements in the United States. And there's a good quote that actually goes way back to 1818. It's from Nathaniel Macon, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. When he talked about public pensions, he said pensions in all countries, and this was in 1818, a long time ago, pensions in all countries begin on a small scale and are at first generally granted on proper consideration, and then they increase till at last they are granted often on whim or caprice as for proper considerations. And this, applies to pensions, but it also applies generally to entitlements, but it's hard to see this cycle happening because it happens over multiple decades and it happens very slowly. But it was actually interesting. I talked to, well, we emailed a couple times to John about his book, and I had actually written a chapter that I took out of my book, but I'm going to put back in the next one on the history of America's first funded pension plan. I just felt like it didn't really make the cut, but now I actually do think it makes the cut. And what it does is it is a great microcosm of the entitlement cycle. So the way and this happens over multiple decades, but the way it plays out is you have the creation of entitlement and you have very well-defined eligibility limits at that point. And then just over decades, they expand and expand and expand. And it usually happens during times of plenty and election cycles. And all of a sudden you wake up one day and it's gotten to the point of it's not fundable anymore. And then you have the contraction phase. I'm not going to go through everything here. And if you want to see the chapter, I can email it to you. I do still have the chapter. It's just not in the actual book. But the U.S. Navy pension plan is a great example of this. It was founded in 1800. It's actually a funny story. So it was the first funded pension plan because the Navy, in order to compete with privateers and recruit for the Navy was actually allowed to keep the prizes of ships that they seized, and that was used to fund the U.S. Navy pension plan. But it followed that cycle. So it was established in 1800. In 1813, time of plenty, because the U.S. Navy during the War of 1812 was capturing all these ships, and you had a ton of money coming in. That kept coming in until through 1816, 1817, which also was a time of plenty, and you saw the benefits expanding. Then, I mean, there's more to it. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but eventually they expanded so far, and there was a huge expansion in 1837, right before the Panic of 1837 and a deep depression. Within 4 years, the funding was completely gone for the U.S. Navy pension plan. So it's a great just microcosm of how this plays out. There's an interesting thing when you think about this in terms of cycle. There's often people quote Roosevelt as justification for the entitlements, no matter what. But the funny thing is if you look back to what Roosevelt did, he was at the creation phase of the entitlement cycle, where it was a very defined purpose, and he was very, very scared about fiscal deficits. And this is a quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is a quote just kind of articulating the fear of spending beyond our means during that time period. So I thought that was just kind of an interesting thing to bring up.
So
So
Mark,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
this pension plan goes way, way back to the Roman legions.
Yeah,
A
that's
Roman
true.
legionnaire
Yep.
lasted 20 years. He would get
Yep.
a pension from
Yep.
the emperor. And it's interesting how that habit has gone on to our public servants, fire and police. You can retire after 20 years on a full pension.
Yeah.
And the Navy pension plan, after they ran out of funding, they just went to a pay-as-you-go
That's right.
for all federal pensions. And I've talked to public officials who've said, "Oh, you don't need to fund a pension. You can pay as you go because the economy will grow fast enough to take care of the extra costs." And
Yeah.
trillions and trillions and trillions of unfunded liability.
Yeah. Yeah, it just it repeat, and the Navy. The funny thing is, they actually brought the Navy pension back. I didn't write about this, but they actually did bring it back on a funded basis, and they ran out again. So it happened twice. I only wrote about this one, but it actually did happen twice.
The same thing happened to Social Security. They set it up with the intention of building a reserve fund to actually self-fund it from the investments. But after a year, they decided too many people needed the pension, so they threw that away, and that's been the problem with Social Security being underfunded.
And this is, I do want to pause, especially since this is recorded. I am talking about the finances here. I understand that there are benefits. I understand you just can't cut people off, that it's not an easy problem to solve. But the math of the finances, it is what it is. And, people need to recognize that. That is really what I'm trying to do here. So this is you have the microcosm of the U.S. Navy pension plan, and this is how it's played out at the federal level. So if you go all the way back to 1940, what this graphic shows is as a percentage of GDP, major cost items in the U.S. budget. And you can see defense is the orange. During World War II, it was enormous, obviously. Blue is the safety net, so it includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and income security programs like unemployment. And mathematically, there's no denying where the issue is. Surprisingly, and I was actually surprised by this, because you hear a lot in the news, definitely politically, that we've wasted so much money on defense, and I'm sure we have, but as a percentage of GDP, it's pretty steadily been declining over the past 40 or 50 years. And the blue line, which is the safety net, you can see it's massively expanding. A lot of the major expansions have occurred around or immediately after election years, because it was part of the promise. And now you have a situation where the debt has gotten so high, and with what's happened with inflation pushing interest rates up, now you got a problem with the interest. I mean, the interest is now more than defense. I mean, that's how bad it's gotten. And this is a pretty serious problem. So this is just a gross debt to GDP. The public debt is not much different. And you could just see how dramatically different this is from the past. We spent an enormous amount during World War II, and that got the U.S. debt, up to pretty high levels, the highest levels historically. Well, we're now above those levels and set to go much, much higher. And this is clearly not a sustainable trend, or at least not a desirable trend, that's for sure. And the other thing that gets missed is, and this is frustrating, and this goes back to Hamilton. So Hamilton knew that you needed a lot of capacity to handle emergencies. And these projections don't factor in, major emergencies. I mean, and who knows what that's going to be? Maybe it's a major natural disaster. Maybe it's a war that breaks out that nobody thinks is even possible. Who knows what that is? But the real problem with this, could we figure out a way to manage it? Maybe, I don't know. At 180 is pretty scary. But, there's no dry powder to handle an emergency. And that is exactly what Hamilton feared, was not having enough capacity to, and by the way, in Scott Bessent's, if I'm not pronouncing that right, I read a lot, which he mentioned that in his testimony to Congress, was that is the problem here, that, we've had adequate debt in World War II and the Civil War to fund it, and it's a concerning prospect if we don't have it in the future. And that's not represented here. So when I pause there, I'm probably close to time. I do have, I want to, actually, let me really, this is just, showing some of the history behind the debt, but I think I've kind of hit that already. The one, actually, the one point here is, there's kind of I think a false hope out there that we can outgrow the debt. And that was actually the big story. And yes, we paid some down and relatively had balanced budgets for about a decade. But the real story of the post-World War II period was relatively balanced budgets for a while, and then great growth, and particularly great productivity growth, particularly in the mid 1900s. And the question is, and I have a chapter in the book on this, is is that really possible going forward? And when you break it down to the big drivers of total real economic output, the question becomes, where's it going to come from? So our population, I'm going to go through this really quickly. Our population growth was huge back in the 1800s, pretty strong back in the 1900s. It's pretty weak going forward. Our labor force participation rate, so how many people in that population are working, doesn't look great. I mean, maybe it goes up a little, maybe it goes down a little, but it doesn't look great. Our estimates of what is the natural rate of employment, which is really the inverse of the natural rate of unemployment, is, it's, can you really squeeze out more there? It seems pretty unlikely. And then this was amazing to me. The average work week of the US labor force. Now, I'm not saying you want to go back to an average of 70 hours a week, but I mean, it has declined substantially since the 1830s. Now, this is not a perfect, like the data is not perfect. I had to use some sources, some different sources, but I mean, the general message is accurate that people are working less than they used to. And then the productivity growth, and there's a great quote from Robert Solow, who was kind of an expert economist on productivity. And people assume, and people are assuming with AI, and maybe it is the moonshot that is going to solve our problems, but I'm going to take the under on it. And they underestimate just how impactful technologies that seem boring today were in the mid 1900s. I mean, air conditioning allowed factories, electricity, air conditioning allowed factories to run constantly and regardless of weather. Cars, airplanes, these things are home appliances were enormous. It was, imagine washing your clothes manually all the time. It's laundry pain in the ass enough. But that is what allowed women to enter the workforce, was that the home appliances freed up so much time. So, are computers improving productivity? Yes, absolutely. But when you compare it to technologies that we think are boring, I mean, it's a pretty high threshold to beat. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Okay, Mark, can I throw a question on, of course, the debt is an issue unless somebody has credit in the same country. And I was just wondering if you compare this to the private credit or private surplus in the US, all the citizens, etc. So how has that evolved in the same period? And I'm not saying you can just move it from left pocket to right pocket, but it's, as a country, of course, it's state and people. So
yeah, I mean,
how does that look?
I mean, we do have a lot of our net worth on the private, on the private side is high. Now, taxing it there's going to be political opposition to that. But I mean, that probably
that was not my point, Mark. It was just when people look at the US, they look, of course, on the totality, right? So I'm just saying, I'm not saying that is the solution. I'm just saying some comfort, I assume.
Yeah, no, well, that gets to the last question, which is, how do you address it? And I'm more on pointing out the problem than designing specific solutions. But there are a lot of levers that can be pulled. Higher taxes, reduction of entitlement benefits or adjustments to eligibility, cuts to other federal programs, which it's interesting that this presentation is happening right now. You're seeing right now. Intentional inflation, which I do not think is a good option. Jim will talk more about that. But there's got to be a lot of levers to pull here. And it's going to take all of them. And you can't just cut people off. I mean, everyone knows that. But the sooner we address this, the more we can spread it out. It's like a mortgage. If you wait until 10 years and all of a sudden the mortgage comes due and you haven't prepared for that, I mean, that's a big problem. But if you can spread the costs out, you can make it tolerable. But Americans are going to have to suffer or are going to have to sacrifice. And that just seems like a very big mentality shift. Nobody remembers that prior to World War II, that this is not how the finances of the United States were managed. That's just a fact. And nobody knows that. So switching that mentality, I think it's going to be the biggest challenge for not only our generation, but then definitely the next generation. So
if I can just throw one more comment, Mark, and that's I come from a very, very small country, not at all comparable to the glorious US, but Denmark, which is on some people's lips these days for other reasons, and my country has been shrinking for hundreds of years, right? We've given away Norway, Sweden, Virgin Islands, and now somebody's coming for Greenland. So I wonder what will be left when I retire. But I think the country was in huge deficit back in the 80s, and the government at that time was saying we're heading towards the edge. So and everybody sort of okay, we get it. And then they introduced what they called the potato cure. So and but basically that was what it was, right? And
what was
the
the
whole
potato cure?
country's well, it was basically everybody stopped eating steaks and started eating potatoes. So it was a massive
Interesting
cure on the people really higher taxations, less benefits, the whole thing, right? And it took 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is I always tell the good news is it's going to sound surprising because this seems pretty dark, but the United States has a pretty darn good track record of fixing things when they're forced. And the sad thing about this is the sooner we act, the less painful it will be. But I actually do have faith, and it's based on a track record. It's not just blind faith that the United States will solve this. We are a nation of innovators when it comes down to it, fixers, and there is enough of that thread still running through our history. May not have been tested for a while, but when it is tested, I think it'll prove strong. So that's my last comment.
Excellent. Love the optimism, Mark. Love it.
Any other questions, or we can move to Jim?
I have a naive question. So I first heard about the debt crisis 40 years ago, and there's consistently a bunch of people talking about the sky is falling, but I haven't felt any negative consequences. Have there been any negative consequences over the last 40 years?
I mean, I think you're seeing negative consequences now. I actually have a newsletter coming out. Well, let me switch to that where you can learn about it. So I have a free newsletter.
Well, let me finish the question and then I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Sorry.
So the soft question is, have there been negative consequences? And then secondly, when, why will we hit a tipping point, and what will be the consequences then?
So I think you are seeing consequences now. I think the U.S. may not have hit their technical limit on the debt, but I actually think we have reached the psychological limit. And, you know, if you look at the underlying currents around the rise, the return of Trump and the Trump administration, my belief is that the real root, if you look below all the waves, there is a desire for the United States to pull back and look internally and kind of return to its isolationist roots, which we haven't seen in almost 100 years. And I think it's the debt that is driving this, and people starting to realize that they don't want to spend on some of these things anymore. So I think there is consequences. And then in terms of just why wasn't it a big deal 40 years ago? Well, 40 years ago we were like here, we're at 40% of GDP. We are at 100 and over 120% now. So saying the sky is falling at 40%, it was higher than it usually was in the past, but it's a fraction of where it is right now, and it's only projected to get much worse. So I think we're fundamentally in a different place than we were 40 years ago.
Thanks.
But when I end, does that answer, or I mean, it may not be a definitive answer, but does that address your question?
It does.
Yeah. Okay. So, just where to learn more. Bob mentioned the book. A lot of this is, you can see it happening in the book. I do have a free newsletter on Substack if you want to subscribe to it. I have a issue coming out. It's going through compliance right now that talks a lot about, the debt being the root of some of the political things we're seeing right now. And then, for trustees, if you want to check out a site, I have a lot of educational material for trustees. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay, hey, wait, Mark, thanks very
Okay.
much. Maybe one more question from Jay. Nellie, I saw you had a comment in the chat about cryptocurrency. Let's table that until Jim's comments. But Jay,
Okay.
one more question for Mark.
So just one thing, we had Dr. Art Laffer, the economic
Uh-huh.
advisor to Reagan, Clinton, and Trump in his last presidency, come and speak at Davidson College just within the last few months. And
Okay.
he would talked about two specific items. One was tariffs and two was taxation. They're his two
Mhm.
areas of expertise. One, he made the comment, and this is Art Laffer saying Trump is not an isolationist. The whole concept of tariffs to him is just negotiating a business tactic. And he gave an example of being up at a G7 meeting in Canada. And right as he was walking out, he turned to the other six leaders and said, if you'll drop all your tariffs, we'll drop all ours. And he's like, that's just an example of the way
Yeah.
Trump moves. My question to you is, Art Laffer is also an expert, one of the foremost experts on taxation. And he was talking about like during the Kennedy administration, during that administration, the top tax rate fell from 70% down to below 30%.
Yeah.
And same with corporate taxes. So did you do an overlay of tax
Well,
policy? A lot of
the
people.
funny thing is, the tariff thing is just kind of emerging. I mean, I kind of agree that that is a tax. It's not. It's being portrayed as a more permanent inflationary phenomenon. That to me just seems like an external tax, but you know, that's a little new to me. But the tax situation in terms of, I mean, I kind of agree with Laffer on people often compare current taxes to the World War II Great Depression era without acknowledging the fact that they were extremely high by historical standards. You know, it kind of goes like taxation goes like that and then back down, but it's higher than it was before then. And they ignore the fact that that was a very exceptional time. And I would actually also argue that increasing tax rates during the Depression was not a good idea. I mean, that's basically, you know, that's restrictive. It's making the Depression worse. Now, World War II was necessary because we had to pay for the war, but that I see a lot of this. So, and I think one of the dangers right now is the 1950s were such an exceptional time, and everybody is looking back to that nostalgically as if that was the norm rather than an anomaly. And it comes out with the taxes. It comes out with we were very extremely wealthy back then. Of course, times were going to be great, but it wasn't sustainable. And I think a lot of the misperceptions today, I think the overspending on entitlements came from a misperception of our own wealth. Does that answer I went off on a little tangent. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, again, it gets into like, what's the remedy to the problem? Is it going back to like really high tax rates again? And people just really have to kind of get that into their mindset that there's probably only going to be one way to balance this, either cutting the benefits or increasing the taxes or growing GDP. But
I mean, it's pretty clear that the thing that's changed is that this is just the math of it. The thing that has changed is spending. It's not taxes. If you look at over the past 60 years, the average tax rate, you know, it's going up and down, but we're at an average, maybe slightly above average total rate of federal taxes. I have a graphic I don't have it available right now, but it's in the book. It was surprising to me. I thought taxes were going down, but they actually are not. The spending is what's going up. Now, I'm not saying higher taxes is not part of the solution, but it's not really the cause of the problem.
Okay, Mark, thank you. And great questions. With that, let's turn things over to Jim.
Okay, well, first I want to say, Mark, I heartily endorse your premise that there's not enough study of history in among financial analysts. In fact, I would say there's way too much reliance on mathematical modeling and way too little reliance on historical interpretation. So, you know, I can't wait to read your book. I know it's sitting in my mailbox you know, back in California, but
I started yours and yours is good too. So we're on the same page.
all right, good. So, all right. Bob, thanks for inviting me to speak to this audience. And I'm going to try to convey the essential ideas of my book in a few minutes. And, we're not going to, definitely not going to get to everything. But just some high points. So let me figure out again how to share my screen. I feel like I'm reinventing the wheel every time I do this. Here we go. All right, there we go. So the main theme of Black Hole is that money creation has important economic consequences that very few people are aware of. And I think this will surprise many investors who don't understand the money creation process if they think of it at all. And it's very relevant to today's discussion about public finance, because as we're going to see in a few minutes, if you understand money creation, you're in a much better position to understand why we have this great debt and how we might get out of it. Okay, but let me just give you an introduction about the massive amount of misunderstanding about money creation. Writing this book was about a 2-year project, and the idea came out of a conversation that I had with my daughter and son-in-law about 4 years ago. And they just purchased their first house. And we were chatting about their mortgage loan. And I said, well, isn't it interesting that the $300,000 you borrowed, for your house is brand new money created by the bank specifically for your mortgage. Your mortgage loan is money that didn't even exist before the banker made the loan. And my daughter, who's, she's a smart lawyer, and she looked at me like I was nuts. And my son-in-law, who's a tech executive, he quickly corrected me and he said, no, he said, banks lend out other people's savings. They lend out the money that people are not using right now. And I explained to him that, banks don't lend out other people's money. And on the contrary, banks create new money every time a bank makes a loan. And in the modern banking system, all the money that exists was first created by a commercial bank when it made an investment. And I thought, if these two bright people were completely unaware of money creation, how many others have no idea how it comes into existence? So I started digging, and I discovered that money creation is widely misunderstood, even among those who should know. Economists, academics, journalists, they either do not address the topic, or they're wrong about it, or they contradict each other. And this seemed like a big problem to me. And so I decided to learn more and write a book about it. And so hence this project. So Bob suggested that I share my main findings here. And so I've listed 6 here, which I'll go through quickly, and we'll just be able to discuss some of them. First, money creation by banks has ancient historical roots. Throughout history, money creation in the banks is essentially, it's unchanged, the process. However, what has changed is the nature of bank reserves. 2, individual banks create money by investing, that is, by making loans or purchasing securities. And the implications are that commercial banks do not lend out their cash reserves or their deposits, that bank reserves play a very limited role in constraining the money supply, and that the, quote, money multiplier, which most of us were taught in school, is actually not a real thing. 3, the purpose of quantitative easing was to create money or monetize debt when the banks were unwilling to lend. The purpose of it was not to create more bank reserves, as is often claimed. 4, money creation by profit-seeking banks is subject to market discipline, and therefore it's generally more productive and non-inflationary. However, money creation, when it's controlled by government monetary authorities, is often unproductive and inflationary. 5, the ability, here we're getting into the public policy question. The ability of central banks to monetize debt encourages governments to borrow excessively. And as a result, sovereign debt has now reached a critical level, as Mark very eloquently detailed. And finally, governments will likely address these high levels of sovereign debt through something called financial repression, which I think will profoundly affect investors. And so now we can dive into a few more of those points in a little detail. All right, I'm going to take you back now. Modern banking was invented at the time when gold had already been universally accepted as money for thousands of years. And in about 16th century Europe, the goldsmith guild became a highly trusted group. And so this goldsmith was a trusted custodian of precious metals. And at first, the goldsmith would record a customer's deposit, of gold, a coin or bullion or artifact by using a paper receipt, which was the forerunner of banknotes. The depositors soon learned to trade these receipts among each other as money. And at some point, the goldsmiths realized that very few people were coming in to exchange their receipts for gold. So the goldsmith got this wonderful, awful idea. Actually, it was a real innovation. Print more receipts than the amount of gold on demand, on deposit, and then lend those receipts out and charge interest. Genius. A true simple innovation. It's the birth of modern banking. Now, since these receipts, later called banknotes, were accepted as money, the goldsmith banker was able to expand the money supply. Right? And you can see this chart here. Note that the banker's balance sheet is expanding when he lends out these new banknotes. And under this system, the money supply, which is defined as all the money available for exchange, consists of, number one, the physical gold circulating as money independent of the banking system, the gold that was already out there, and two, the banknotes issued by the banks, some of which are covered by bank cash reserves, gold, and some of which are covered by loans, but all have equal value when they circulate as money. Now, money is just as easily destroyed or exterminated when the loan is repaid. The borrowed banknotes are returned to the bank. They no longer circulate as money, so they're no longer in the money supply. The loan, which is a promissory note, is torn up, the bank's balance sheet and the money supply shrinks. Now, I want to stress that this loan from a bank stands in contrast to a loan from a non-bank. In this diagram, we see that when a non-bank lends, the balance sheet doesn't expand. No new money is created and no new money is destroyed. It just changes hands. In today's modern banks, we find that money is created and eradicated in the same way it always was, but the difference is in what is bank reserves. Under the gold standard, cash reserves, bank reserves were gold or silver coins or bullion that customers would deposit for safekeeping. And of course, they also wanted to share in the interest income of the bank. And since banks always need enough cash reserves to meet depositor withdrawals, these gold deposits, the depositors, were actually the main regulators of the bank's activities. For example, if depositors didn't like the interest rate they were getting, if it was too low, they could just withdraw their gold. And the bank had to raise the rate to attract more reserves. Just one example. Now, by contrast, in today's banking system, bank reserves are created and controlled by a central bank that has been vested with the legal authority to do this. Bank reserves now consist of paper cash in the bank vault, plus its electronic equivalent, which is a ledger entry deposit at the central bank in an account for the commercial bank. Okay, now that is a quick blow through of, how banks developed and evolved. But at this point, I would like to ask you to do a little heavy lifting and show you, in accounting terms, how central banks create cash reserves. Now, this procedure is called an open market purchase that's been used for decades. It's a three-party transaction that's accomplished in two steps. And the three parties involved are a private non-bank investor, the investors' commercial bank, and the central bank. Now, when the central bank wants to create bank system reserves, it contacts a private investor in the open market. And this investor could be any pool of money, any non-bank owner of a government bond who has a bank account. And the central bank will then offer to purchase a treasury bond, and the investor agrees to the price. And then to pay for the bond, the central bank instructs the investor's commercial bank to credit the investor with a new deposit. And then to compensate the commercial bank for its new liability, the central bank creates new made-up reserves to the commercial bank's account at the central bank. And then the central bank takes ownership of the bond. You can probably follow it better in the diagram. And the result is that the central bank balance sheet expands, the commercial bank balance sheet expands, and new money is added to the money supply in the investor's bank account. You see the blue arrow on the right? The central bank is basically using the commercial bank as a pass-through entity to create new money. Now, you could also think of this as two separate transactions in which the commercial bank first buys the bond, creating new money, a deposit in the bond seller's bank account. And then it's followed by the central bank purchasing the bond from the commercial bank and creating bank reserves to pay for it. In reality, under open market operations, both transactions happen simultaneously. Now, here's why understanding this transaction is important. Until the financial crisis in QE, the main purpose of this open market purchase was to increase bank reserves, and the equal increase in the money supply was a secondary effect. But now this transaction becomes extremely important under quantitative easing because increasing the money supply becomes its main purpose, while creating reserves becomes the sideshow. So, because quantitative easing was simply this transaction, open market purchases conducted in very large quantities, trillions of dollars instead of just billions of dollars. So not only did QE create trillions of dollars in new reserves, it also created trillions of dollars in new bank deposits that were handed directly to the owners of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which of course were owned by members of the investor class, who used this new money to buy more investment assets, bidding up prices. And this cycle went on for years. And the new money created by this process tended to stay within the investment markets, and it was the main cause of our current asset bubble. Now, many commenters miss this point because they focus only on the creation of bank reserves while ignoring the massive amount of deposit money created in the commercial banks. During the early years of QE, the overall rate of the money supply growth was not exceptionally high on a historical basis because QE was replacing the money that was not being created due to a subdued level of bank lending post-crisis. However, virtually all the new QE money was directed to professional investors and not to consumers. And as you may know, the purchase of a financial asset does not affect GDP and does not affect the CPI. So the new money born out of QE caused lots of asset inflation, but not very much consumer price inflation. It was where the money was spent, not just the quantity of it, that drove asset prices higher. And, I think probably most of us on this call benefited from this monetary policy as asset prices expanded. All right, sorry if that took some heavy lifting, but I think it's essential to understand the transaction because it plays a pivotal role now in the post-Great Financial Crisis economy.
Hey, Jim.
I should probably take a question after all that.
Yeah, just one thing to make sure I'm following you. Are you saying that during whether it's financial crisis, COVID, the Fed is trying to help the economy by creating money through its commercial bank affiliates, but that new money is going toward asset purchases and not necessarily getting out into the marketplace where consumers can help drive economic growth.
Yeah, that's mostly, I think that's mostly right what you said. If you read Bernanke, he wrote a really revealing op-ed in 2010 in the Washington Post. What the Fed is called What the Fed Did and Why. What they thought was that Bernanke knew that he would be increasing asset prices, raising bond prices, and in so doing, lowering interest rates. He knew he was stimulating the capital markets, but he talked about a virtuous cycle, and he thought that this would trickle down. Some people call it trickle down. He thought that the benefits to Wall Street would trickle down and cause more hiring, more economic stimulus. I don't believe he counted on the fact that the money would stay, I don't want to use the word bottled up, that's not accurate, largely confined to the investment markets for so many years. I think it's the main reason that we had monetary stimulus but didn't see CPI inflation, which most people just call inflation, but we did see asset inflation. So in other words, yes, it was good intention, perhaps. Bernanke thought it would stimulate the economy, the real economy. It did very little of that. Does that answer you?
That helps. Thanks, Jim.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to come back to QE in a moment for as an example of what I think is a mistake. But let's now turn to what I call good money creation, which stands in contrast to bad money creation. And I want to say this because I want to be sure I'm vindicating the banks, because commercial banks for centuries have served a vital role in the economy by creating new credit to viable enterprises that can generate a good cash income stream to repay the loan. And to most people, this is obviously a good thing. Now, I developed this idea of good money creation in detail in Black Hole, but today, for brevity, I just want to review a quote by the economist Richard Werner that illustrates good money creation. Werner points out that when bank credit is used for productive investment, such as the implementation of new technology, increasing productivity, or the creation of new goods and services, then such new money, which always happens when banks grant credit, will not result in any form of overall inflation, either consumer price inflation or asset price inflation. This is because the new purchasing power is used to produce higher value added output, and hence the extra demand due to the money creation is met with higher supply. Now, I wrote an entire chapter on good money creation, so you could see my book for details. But now, by contrast, bad money creation is usually caused by government policy that is not subject to market discipline, and bad money creation causes many problems like asset bubbles, their inevitable destructive contractions, rising commodity and consumer prices, false price signals that lead to misallocation of capital, that in turn results in slow real economic growth, unjust wealth inequality, and it encourages an unwholesome increase in sovereign debt. Now, in Chapter 5, I discussed two historic examples of bad money creation in some detail, and I just want to take a minute and highlight those now because I think they're very instructive. The first was the Japanese asset bubble of the 1980s. And Richard Werner has written a great book called Princes of the Yen, and there's also a video by that name. I recommend them both. And what happened was that for many years, the Japanese Ministry of Finance required Japanese commercial banks to lend excessively, continually creating new money to real estate owners and developers. And the banks therefore generated tons of new money that was plowed back into real estate assets, bidding up the prices. And they kept doing this year after year, even after asset prices had reached absurdly high levels. My second example is the QE asset bubble of 2009 to 2024, which we've been talking about. And here, the Federal Reserve, using this transaction we described earlier, directed commercial banks to participate in QE, and this channeled trillions of dollars of new money into the investment markets using the transaction described earlier. All right, now two quick graphs here, and I included these at the last minute, Bob, and I just want to show you here. This first graph shows the increase in the money supply from 2009 to 2024. This was during the QE years, and you can see $14 trillion was grown. You know, look at from 9 trillion to 22 trillion in just that short time. But 7 trillion of that was added during the pandemic QE years, 2020 to 2022. The next graph shows how much of that was contributed by the Fed purchasing bonds in QE. Fully half of the total, and during the QE years, 5 trillion of the 7 trillion was created by decisions of the Fed, not by decisions of commercial banks. So new money is always created in the commercial banks. It is not always created by commercial bankers. All right. So one of the major consequences of bad money creation, what I'm calling bad money creation, is it's the number one economic problem facing us today, which, you know, Mark highlighted. I agree with him. This is the number one economic problem facing us today. It's the problem of huge unpayable sovereign debt, and we all know the numbers. You know, 36 trillion in debt, deficits increasing every year as far as the eye can see, refinancing costs rising with, you know, debt levels, rising debt levels and higher interest rates. But even worse, the unfunded obligations, the promised entitlements are, you know, that are estimated. You see various estimates by various think tanks, anywhere between 75 to 150 trillion dollars or higher. This is the present value calculation, and this is in addition to the funded debt, the 36 trillion. And this kind of debt literally swamps the entire world's aggregate balance sheet. It is literally unpayable in dollars of today's purchasing power. And I think this debt problem arises from two factors. One is the perverse incentives that politicians have to spend money. And the other is the power of government officials to force the banks to create the money, which the politicians can then spend. Now, I first encountered this problem in 2002, working right here at Brandis, when I was covering Banco Galicia of Argentina. And I noticed the balance sheet of Galicia was growing rapidly as it purchased bonds directly from the government. And then I realized this bank was creating new bank deposits, new money to put into the hands of politicians. This is a classic case of monetizing debt. And, you know, look at Argentina. But all central banks do the same thing, but they do it to a lesser extent and in a roundabout way, as illustrated by the previous QE accounting example, in which the central bank purchased government debt using the commercial bank as a pass-through. So, but I think the real origin of the debt problem seems to be in our politicians' perverse incentives to spend, but with very little accountability for their actions. Because politicians and government officials are incentivized to consider short-term cash flow, just getting to the next election, and not long-term solutions. So they've continued to borrow money until they're approaching the limit of what the bond market can currently accept. And this foolhardy policy, I have to say this anti-Hamiltonian policy, is now, in my view, embedded in the politician's DNA. Remember, it was Dick Cheney who remarked back in 2003, he said, quote, "Reagan taught us deficits don't matter." And today, neither side of the aisle will address reducing the budget. They don't want to touch entitlements. So their incentive is to keep the cash flowing. And they have four levers that they can use to keep the cash flowing. Mark alluded to these. I'll go into it a little more detail here. They can reduce cash outflows by reducing entitlements, and they can reduce interest costs, or they can increase cash inflow by increasing taxes and increasing borrowing. But there's a problem with each one of those levers. Reducing entitlements or even reducing defense spending is a non-starter due to the popularity of these programs. Neither political party even dares to mention reducing entitlements. They could reduce interest costs, but that's a problem because interest costs are rising due to the increasing volume of debt that we have and the rising bond market interest rates. Increasing taxes is not likely unless they can increase nominal GDP. Apropos of the previous question, the US government in the last 80 years has never collected more than 20% of GDP in taxes, even when marginal tax rates were up in the 90% range. And that's probably due to the Laffer effect. And finally, increasing borrowing is problematic because foreign sovereign governments and entities have stopped increasing their holdings of US treasuries. So Uncle Sam is simply running out of borrowers at the current interest rates. So there's a big financial problem. It's
Hey, Jim, on this,
yeah.
take a pause just for a second.
Yeah.
I'm already lining up a bunch of questions that we've gotten either in the chat or things that are coming to mind. But here, with increased taxes, I want to circle back to something that Peter mentioned earlier. And I thought Peter's question was about government debt levels, corporate debt levels, and then debt for individuals. And all of these things seem to be rising, which would put a huge strain on the potential for taxing any of those entities. Like you could try and raise corporate taxes, but you might squeeze all the productivity out of a business, and the same thing with individuals. So that tax lever to me seems less likely to be pulled. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that you're going to get very little more in terms of real taxes. What I'm suggesting is that you're going to have to inflate GDP so that you raise the tax base. Let's just say that you can get 20% of GDP max, and that's the most you can get. You have to raise GDP. If you can grow GDP, nominal GDP at 10%, you'll be able to grow the tax base at 10%, even though that will be mostly inflated dollars.
Again, I think, Bob, my point was not that there's also a lot of private debt. There probably is, but there's also a lot of wealth. So I'm just saying, when you look at a country, you need to look at both the private wealth and you need to look at the public debt. But in relationship to Jim's and the
I'm not hearing that question wherever it's coming from.
Yeah, Peter, we just lost you for a second.
Sorry?
Yeah, you're just cut out.
Is it better now?
That's better now. Yes.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying that again, the Danish cure in 1986, GDP had hit, admittedly not as high as we see here, but 60%, and it was seen as a huge problem. So, and the cure in Denmark was a lot of taxes, a lot of implications for borrowing. You couldn't borrow anymore, and interest rates were heightened a lot, right? And all this led to, of course, that GDP was suffering a bit. But after 4 years, the debt to GDP was down at 30%. So they basically, the country halved its debt in those 4 years. And the debt level in Denmark has stayed around 30% ever since. So that was it was a tough cure, but it worked. And after 4 years, it was not solved, but it was sort of at a reasonable place. And of course, the US debt is much more dramatic. I understand that, but it is just a recent example of how it was done in a very small country. But still, it was very painful. I recall a lot of unemployment as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it involved, someone mentioned earlier, the public, wealth as opposed to debt. I'm sure what it had to do was transfer a lot of wealth from individuals back to pay the debts off, which is the ultimate thing you have to do here. Well, you have to pay somehow. If you pay through inflation, you pay through draining people's wealth. There's just no, I think there's no way out of it.
I agree.
Okay, so my belief is that what we'll see, the government response to this, will determine a lot of how we invest. Because faced with this unpayable debt, at least unpayable in a currency of today's purchasing power, these heavily indebted governments, and not just the USA, is likely going to choose a soft default on this debt in the form of what I know as financial repression. Now, that's because financial repression is less it's not a good thing, but it's less disruptive to the political order than other alternatives such as severe austerity, which sounded like what we were talking about when the gentleman earlier was talking about the potato cure. That sounded like severe austerity to me, or hyperinflation, or outright default. Now, for financial repression to succeed, the government's got to rely on a combination of coercion, public complacency, and probably ignorance. And it consists of a variety of policies related to these four cash flow levers. And to illustrate what it might be like, I'm just going to offer a few examples in each of those categories. And I developed this in detail more in the book, but I stress there are many more things government could do. First, they could reduce real entitlements, keep nominal entitlements, the amount of money that you receive as promised, but they can reduce real entitlements by understating CPI inflation, which reduces the cost of living adjustments. In fact, I have a lot of evidence that they are already doing that, a lot. They can increase tax revenue by inflating the taxable base. We just mentioned that, the nominal GDP. And this could be done by directing bank lending, by directing money creation to GDP producing activities that result in consumer spending or perhaps, industrial development policies. I think this is what J.D. Vance had in mind with an industrial policy, and I think it's possible you'll see this under the Trump administration. They could increase borrowing by finding new lenders. Now, of course, a central bank, lender of last resort, can always resume QE. But in addition, commercial banks can be encouraged or required to purchase government debt, like the Argentines. Or private savers could be encouraged or required to buy more treasuries. And finally, they may find a way to reduce interest costs. Interest rates on, for example, interest on savings deposits or on savings bonds or even T-bills can be suppressed by regulation or law. I mean, after all, the Fed controls pretty much the short-term rates on T-bills. So to some degree, the Fed or the Treasury can also control the yield curve to manipulate interest rates. And I think there's a lot of evidence that Janet Yellen has been doing this, and Scott Bessent will have to do the same thing. So we can expect indebted governments to increase taxes by inflating the tax base. And they'll probably trigger currency devaluation with inflation. And they'll probably push interest rates below the rate of consumer price increases. And they might even install capital controls to discourage investors from pursuing better returns overseas. So collectively, these strategies will impede wealth accumulation by channeling the individual's wealth back to the government that needs the money to pay down the debt.
Jim, can I throw another question to you?
Yeah.
again, sorry for bringing you back to potato cure, but I do think it's very similar, right? The Danish government back in 1986, just before the whole cure was sort of put in front of everybody, they also devaluated the Danish kroner by 8%. To what extent do you think this is also part of the cure that will come this time?
Yeah, so in many cases, it's hard to devalue, you know,
It's a different problem in the US, I understand
it's
that,
a
but is
different
it part of the
monetary
solution?
system now because we have floating exchange rates. With floating exchange rates to devalue, you basically have to inflate, devalue your currency at home. So
You have to
has
create
no
it, I
purchasing
understand that.
power.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But ultimately, do you think this is also part of the solution?
I absolutely do.
No.
I do. I think Trump has said he would like a weaker dollar, and so has Scott Bessent. And they got
The
a
only
long way
thing I
to
don't
go.
get with his cure now, if I can ask you, Jim, is that he wants to reduce interest rates. I don't at all see that as a solution. It's the opposite that is required, isn't it? Or
It depends, I think, on who you are. If you want to reduce the exchange rate, reducing interest rates will probably help. And if people can only get 2% on a T-bill as opposed to 4.5%, there'll be less demand for dollars. So, and I don't know, financial repression can be a complex idea. I'm trying to kind of boil it down to a few ideas, but these policies, when I think they're coming, and I think we're going to have to comply with them, but we don't have to be ignorant of their purpose and their effects. So, this is this will be kind of the cash value of this analysis. How should investors respond to financial repression? Due to geopolitical issues, the investment environment is already changing a lot, and I think financial repression will just complicate it. But in a nutshell, let me give you an outline now of an investment strategy that I believe has a chance for success. And the first thing is, I want to avoid long-term bonds. Bond yields move in multi-decadal cycles, and why they do is mysterious to me, but the fact that they do seems true enough. I think we're likely in a long-term bond market following a 40-year period of declining rates that made any long-term bondholder look like a genius, and that really culminated in March of 2020 with the lowest interest rates in 4,000 years of recorded history. And that's not I don't mean 400, I mean 4,000 years of recorded history. And that comes from a history of interest rates by Homer and Scylla. And that doesn't mean you can't make money in bonds, but in this environment, I think bonds are for experts. And I am going to only buy bonds if I'm willing to hold them for their entire tenor. And I personally need a rate much higher than 4 or 5% to convince me to hold a bond for 10 years or more. Okay, so the second thing I want to do is I want to own stocks, but I want to avoid popular indexes like the S&P 500, which is not a diversified portfolio anymore because of its concentration in the Mag 7. I mean, look what happened yesterday. And which is likely to be a source of cash in the next big downturn because it's the one asset class that everybody's already piled into. And, you can refer to Mike Green's presentation to this group a few weeks ago. So I believe that stock picking is going to be your best bet in a more volatile market. And to me, that means value investing will come back. And I'm not sure. I think I would say that even if I had not spent 20 years at Brandes.
Jim, can I just throw one more question at you, since now you're bringing in investments in stocks, right?
Yeah.
And just there's been a lot of talk about tariffs and whether they're going to be 20 or 40 or 60%. And I just need to throw you this last statement from the potato cure, and then I'm going to stop referring to it. But when Denmark did this in 1987, the tax on import of cars was increased to 180%. So basically, and the tax is still there today. It basically means that every day when they buy one car, they pay for three, right? That was the kind of tariffs that was introduced back then. So I know there's a lot of talk about whether the tariffs are going to be too big, but do you also see that as part of the vocabulary the US is going to use? And what is the implication for stocks in particular outside the US? I guess if tariffs of this nature is coming, is that really going to be great for stocks?
I believe it. I don't believe if we have rapidly or big increases in tariffs, it's not clear that they're actually going to develop that way. I mean, Trump instituted tariffs, Joe Biden added more. We don't talk about that very much. How much Trump, but that being said, if you see a big increase in tariffs, I believe it will be generally a wealth killer, but it will redirect money flows to different places in different industries. And that will mean you will find winners where that money is going to flow. So this is why I would not be, one reason that I would not be an investor in a broad index. I would look for specific stocks that benefited from those specific policies. You can still make money as a value investor if you can figure out where the money is going to flow. Okay, does that answer your question? So yeah, you can make money.
Of course, I understand that. I'm just saying
you make money in stocks, but it's
system,
a different world.
Yeah. I was just saying for the total system, I think tariffs can be quite detrimental, right? But of course, there will always be pockets of interest. I totally agree on that. I'll stop my comments on the potato.
No, I entirely agree. Peter. I think that's I think I would say that your point is almost irrefutable, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right, so this chart here is just an example, and I got it from Russell Napier, who's by the way, a brilliant financial historian. If you want to continue your interest in financial history, this is a period that might look like a little bit like what is ahead, a 16-year period, and you can see that cash and bonds were by far the biggest losers, while small cap stocks and value stocks compensated you pretty well. So it's just, I'm not saying this is not a prediction. It's just an example of what you might see for an extended period. And now, finally, this may be the most controversial thing I would say. I want to own gold because I view gold and other precious metals as the go-to asset during a financial repression, both because of the inflation that's involved and because of the low real yields on bonds, which tend to make gold more attractive. Now, there are also very importantly, there's some major political realignments going on right now that favor gold over the dollar at the margin, and I suspect this is a long-term trend. So in my view, everybody should own precious metals as part of their conservative portfolio. And finally, not to ignore this point, I think we should consider our role as voters and good citizens as we look at this public debt. If we're ever going to restore sound money, we have to first understand money creation better, and then we'll be able to elect better, more knowledgeable representatives who can implement the needed reforms. I mean, what if everybody had understood that the government could not expand their debt to the level they did if the Fed were not monetizing that debt? If everyone understood that, would we be in the position we are today? I tend to doubt it. I tend to think people don't understand that point at all. All right, so in closing, if you read Black Hole in Economics, let the sound money revolution begin with you today. If you find it useful, a couple of sentences in the Amazon review section would be greatly appreciated. And with that shameless promotion, I'll stop.
All right, Jim. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks to you again. I'm glad I blocked out 2 hours for us, and congrats to the hardy folks who are still with us. I've got a couple questions that came up in the chat. Before I dive into those, anything else from anybody still on the line? Okay, let me jump into a couple that we got in the chat. One we got maybe an hour or so ago about cryptocurrency and what is its role in all of this. And I know, Jim and Mark, I talked to you earlier about this. I don't suspect your attitude will have changed much. I think, but before I paraphrase what you shared before, I'll turn the floor over to you. Maybe start with Mark. I haven't heard from you in a while. Any thoughts on
I
crypto?
mean, I feel like I've lived through enough of these things vicariously, but over the past 200, even more than that. I mean, going back to tulips and the Mississippi bubble and the South Sea bubble to there's a great quote from and I don't know it offhand, but it's something to the effect of from John Kenneth Galbraith that there's rarely any real financial innovation. It's usually just some small permutation of a previous a previous event. And there is some uniqueness to just the technology of cryptocurrency, but well, first of all, it's not a currency, but it's more like digital specie, if you could call it anything. And I don't see the long-term argument for it. So can it last a while because speculative episodes last longer than you think they're going to? Sure, but I don't see it as anything more than that.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll come back, Mark. I think you had raised a question in the chat about what's a viable alternative, and I think the context for that was the Fed's money creation, trying to increase the money supply. Was that it, or did I misread?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was referring to the slide where you showed the commercial banks and the private investor, assuming that the Fed needed to do something because there were deflationary pressures, was there a way to target the private investors where you wouldn't be creating more money? That was my question. Was there an alternative?
Well, anytime the Fed engages in that transaction, they're going to be creating money. I think one question is if they're going to do this and not put money creation in the hands of the private bankers. See, that's my premise.
Yeah, that was my question. Was there a way
money
to do
creation,
it?
money
Yeah.
creation,
Yeah.
money creation was meant, at least in the United States and in England, and we, in a large manner, modeled our system after England and really the whole world now. Money creation is meant to be inherent in the system is meant to be determined by the investment decisions of private bankers who respond to the prospect of profit and loss, who have to answer to shareholders in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
This was a decision. There's a great debate in the United States throughout the 19th century, and they deliberately left money creation in the hands of private business, and that has mainly served people well, and it's been mostly non-inflationary. So, but the minute the government gets into using the banks to create money that does not have a productive purpose, that's when you get asset bubbles, inflation, and the problems. But how do you? But given all that, okay, it's nice to say, well, let's just put it back in the hands of the commercial banks. Okay, that worked really well until QE, but we have this big problem now. We have this problem of the debt where we have promises that cannot be kept. Who doesn't get paid?
Mm-hmm.
Who doesn't get paid? And so that is the only answer I have to that is the financial repression idea in general sketch. But I think it's ironic that what I think will happen, Mark, it almost has to happen, the logic tells me this, is that government will get involved in the banking system and they'll use the banks to create the money that will basically inflate the system and then ultimately indirectly bail out the debt. So it's like the arsonist becomes the fireman. The same entity that caused the asset bubble and the problems and got us in intractable debt is now going to use the same tools to try to get us out. which I find very ironic.
Yeah. I want to come. Thank you, Jim. I want to come back
Thanks,
to
Jim.
one more comment for Peter, and what proved to be very successful in Denmark. What happened to the politicians who were promoting those measures? Because Jim made a really important point about the politicians' role in money creation, debt creation, inflationary problems. What happened to the politicians in Denmark?
Well, the outgoing government that had created the problem in the public eye, they were sort of social democrats. The incoming government was conservatives, so right wing, and of course extremely unpopular in the years that came, but surprisingly stayed in power for a decade. And as I mentioned, the public debt went from 60 to 30 within 4 or 5 years, but the whole problem was only solved in 10 years later. And of course, the price was big raise in unemployment. This was just when I left university, so I recall this. Many of my fellow students, they didn't get jobs. High interest rates, GDPs nowhere, right? No real increase in the economy. So it was a tough time. But I think, the US has tried this in earlier decades, but this one is a more recent one, hence why I thought I wanted to share it, because it was interesting. But Denmark is a very small and very open economy, unlike the US, which is a very large and closed economy. And my example with the cars only worked, partly worked because Denmark doesn't produce any cars. So it was an easy one. And they didn't hurt a domestic car industry. Now, you could say that the US economy, it's not so that the car industry is doing fantastically well already, so there's not much more to be hurt. But of course, the import of cars could still, import of luxury goods, I guess that's where the US will have to go, right? And that will be painful for the rest of us outside the US, but it will, of course, also be painful for the US.
I have to jump in. That is another issue that again, you see it in a time lapse basis, and I'm not saying this individually, but I'm saying broadly. There's the United States has become very intolerant of economic pain. And this is with the Fed. If you look historically at long periods of extended periods of high inflation, there's a reason that recessions come, because you have to tighten and get rid of every last ember of inflation. And it started a year ago. I remember when it started with Austin Goolsbee talking, almost celebrating that, we were going to navigate a soft landing. And I'm like, if that's the outcome, I'll celebrate you. But that can't be the goal. The goal is price stability. And if you need to cause economic pain to get price stability, you need to do it. And I just feel like there's this general, and you've seen it build over time because we've been an exceptionally wealthy nation since the end of World War II, that there is, and I'm not saying this on an individual basis, I recognize that there's always pain somewhere in the economy, but broadly speaking, I feel like I've witnessed a reduced tolerance for economic pain in this country, and I think it's counterproductive.
I agree.
Bob, a quick comment regarding the motivation of politicians. I have a quote in the book from you might remember Luxembourg Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker back in the 2012 crisis. He said, quote, "We all know what to do. We just don't know how to get reelected after we do it."
That's great.
And another quick comment. I've got a little section. Russell Napier, the economic historian, describes in some of his work how the UK came out of their big post-war debt with basically a policy of financial repression throughout the 50s, almost about 20 years of financial repression, where the growth in the standard of living in the UK was very poor. In other words, the people will suffer while the government pays down its debt, like Denmark.
Yeah.
Well, or like the UK under Thatcher, right? It was the same story. It's painful, and she was not very popular, but she was iron.
Well, there's something else that jumps to mind. I'm not sure I can pull off this analogy, but Mark used the word ember, the last ember of inflation. And I heard something interesting earlier as we're dealing with forest fires here in Southern California yet again. And somebody was arguing that the policy for forest fires changed in the 60s and 70s, where the goal was to stamp them out completely. So, and as a kid in the 70s, I remember Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires. And this guy was saying, actually, we need forest fires.
Yeah.
We need them regularly to burn off all that,
Yeah.
that tinder.
Exactly right.
We have to get through that pain. But in the 60s and 70s, we said we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want to have them at all. And it reminded me of something, Mark, you talked about this.
Good analogy.
Good
You
analogy.
thank you. You
Yeah.
talked about this in your book. Like, people don't respond to, oh, we need to do this, and you have to go through some pain. There has to be some crisis for people to say, oh, no, okay, I guess I have to do something. So do you foresee a crisis? What's the trigger point? What's going to happen that's going to trigger people to say, okay, I guess we have to change our ways? Because unless we have that crisis, unless we have
I
maybe
wish I knew
fire-
the answer to that.
Okay.
That's what worries me. It's not that little projection that the CBO puts together. What worries me is where reserve currencies get lost, and when there's some kind of debt crisis, it's not just kind of slowly happens, it's some shock. And who knows, that could be a major natural disaster. It could be a war that we didn't anticipate. Who knows what it's going to be? But that's how the Dutch lost their dominant reserve currency was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in the 1700s. The pound sterling lost out to the dollar in World War I and World War II. And if we have put ourselves in a situation where we're vulnerable to that sort of thing. But when and how it's going to happen, that's anybody's guess. And that is what Alexander Hamilton worried about. He wanted to have sufficient capacity to handle emergencies, not what's happening right now.
So could I ask two questions on two totally different topics, but I'd be interested in Jim and Mark. I agree with on the crypto, going back to the crypto. We've heard this from the Trump administration idea of building a national crypto stockpile and making America the crypto capital of the world. And we even have a crypto czar now and a SEC friendly commissioner. That's one question. Then the second question, which is totally separate, but maybe you guys could address it, is back in 2020, I was at the meeting and Warren Buffett had said, with regards to stimulus, which really goes into everything you were talking about, Jim, he said, we're doing things that we really don't know the ultimate outcome to. I think in general, they're the right thing, but I don't think they're without consequences. And I think they could be of extreme consequences if pushed far enough. But there would be kind of extreme consequences if we didn't do it as well. Just your thoughts on those two?
I'm not sure what he's talking, to be honest with you, what Warren Buffett was talking about specifically. What was he talking about specifically?
The extreme fiscal and monetary policies to reinflate, I'm going to say, asset prices in the United States and avert.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept, what we talked about, the concept, I think maybe they're not, catastrophic yet, but they're certainly heading in a direction where they could be. I don't know if Jim want you to take a shot on that too. Really quickly on cryptocurrency. I mean, you know how I feel about cryptocurrency. I think having a cryptocurrency reserve it makes no sense. But that's me.
I'm going to bet that given Buffett's vintage, I'm going to bet what he was talking about is preventing a big contraction of the quantity of money. In other words, every time you've seen that, and a banking system like we have, especially backed by, especially when you have no tolerance for pain, Mark, is very, very subject to depressions and recessions when the quantity of money collapses, when you have a credit collapse. And we have decided as a government and a nation that we are not going to permit that. So I think Buffett was probably alluding to the idea of, well, let's just prevent the money supply from contracting so rapidly that we have a big depression. Now, argue what I'm going to guess he was alluding to is that the Fed went way, way beyond that. I mean, way beyond that. Just look at the money supply numbers in that chart. Okay, so on the question of cryptocurrencies, I'll try to be brief, but I'm rooting for Bitcoin because it arises from the market. But I don't see how it can be money. I don't see how it can be used as money. And therefore, I'm skeptical that it will be. And I keep trying to convince myself that it's going to work, and I can't get there. So that's a very condensed view of my thinking. On the question of a Bitcoin reserve, I mean, where are they going to get the Bitcoin? They're going to spend government money to buy it. I know they're going to get some of it from confiscating it from criminals, which, okay.
That's that. Who cares? Yeah.
Right. But how is it going to help? You're going to sell it. You have to sell it for dollars and then, you then pay down your debt. I don't quite get it. What I suspect, and I'm very suspicious about this, is that Trump has said this in order to entice the Bitcoin family to support him. I think that's my guess. He says all kinds of things. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to add to the reduced tolerance for pain, I am definitely differentiating healthy recessions from letting the whole forest burn down. I mean, there, if you'll read this in the book, if you read the book, what really caused World War II was the Great Depression, and that was really a failure of the Federal Reserve to stop it. And yes, should there have been a recession after the Roaring '20s? Yes, but it shouldn't have gone that far, and it destabilized Germany. It inspired militarism in Japan, which they needed a colonial empire because they're so impoverished. So, 100 million people died because of that. I am not an advocate of all-out depressions, but I do feel like we need to increase our sensitivity to recessions because I do think that's healthy.
Jim, I have a question for you on crypto. If your conclusion is you can't get there, that it'll be used as money, and you turned out to be right, does that mean all cryptocurrencies go to zero at some point?
I don't know. I couldn't estimate the downside, but as a proxy for the upside, I would just ask you to look at Fartcoin. Have you seen this? No. Have you seen this? There's even one with a positive market cap called Butthole. That's how nutty this craze for these are cryptocurrencies. It's been. Now, I don't want to put Bitcoin in the same class. I could see the technology, as I understand it, as a vehicle. It's got very good provenance. It's a very good. The database really can't be hacked. It'd be a very good way to carry ownership, for example, of gold. What if you wanted to have gold ownership that was accounted for through Bitcoin transfer? That makes a lot of sense to me. Cryptocurrency transfer. But the crypto itself as just as I understand it, a space in a database, like a piece of an Excel spreadsheet. That's the only way I can kind of conceive of it. I don't see the value as money. People have to agree on that. Will they all agree? I mean, when are people in India who are the 7 billion people in the country who don't even know about Bitcoin going to adopt it as money? I don't see how. I want it to happen. I don't see how.
There's a great quote from John Kenneth Galbraith when he was talking about there's a whole scene in the late 1920s where investment companies, mutual fund companies essentially, were that you can make so much money by lending in the call markets, providing margin loans, that they started taking investors' money, loaning it to people, and then those people would turn around and invest it back into the fund. Mm-hmm. And he was describing just the insanity of that situation. And I use this quote to describe the whole meme coin thing. just to add a little humor, he said, "It's difficult not to marvel at the imagination which was implicit in this gargantuan insanity. There must be madness. There's something to be said for having it on a heroic scale." That's kind of how I look at that whole phenomenon.
A giant Ponzi scheme. I've got a question, Jim. You talked about investment strategy, and it was all U.S. Small cap stocks and stock picking and value stocks. Well, with a weaker dollar, what do you think about international stocks and bonds and emerging markets?
Yeah, even I think you're onto something great, and I would never restrict my search for stocks to the U.S. only. I mean, U.S. Market, the MSCI index will show you that the U.S. Component of the MSCI today is at 75% of the world index. No, more normally it's 40, 50, maybe 60, 75%. And that's gone nothing but up since the great financial crisis. That seems extreme to me. Of course, that's part of the dollar flows into U.S. stocks. That's part of the reason for the strong dollar. But no, I think no, you have to look elsewhere. And I would think you get much better fundamental returns in some emerging markets and perhaps Europe, although I think Europe has some structural problems that they'll probably address and overcome to some degree. But no, I agree. You got to look outside, and you're better if you get a weaker dollar. You're better. A weakening dollar, your better opportunities will come from outside the U.S. That makes sense to me.
Okay.
Bob, just a personal comment from me.
Yep.
Ron Payton, it's great to see you. Consultant extraordinaire. I learned a lot from you. Barclay Douglas, you may remember too.
I do.
Absolutely. But it's great to see you. Maybe we can catch up later on.
Great to see you too. Thank you. I'd love to. I got your name down, as a matter of fact. I've just reunited with Bob, and that's great after several years. So it's nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to hear Mark and Jim. Very, very good. I took a lot of notes.
Oh, thank you. It was great. It was a pleasure to be here, and hope there are some good insights you can use.
Yeah, I'll buy the book too, both of them.
Oh, well, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much to each of you, especially for sticking around here after an hour and 50 minutes. We'll get the recording out hopefully later this week. And looking ahead, the only scheduled meeting that we have is, I think, March 27th, where we've got two board members, Rick Carew on the Asia Pacific board and Yingming Chen. They're going to talk about Chinese technology stocks, which I think might get a little more interest given what happened yesterday with DeepSeek. So, that's a couple months away, but I will schedule another board meeting before that, even if it's something as simple, just to take a look at the projects we've got in the works. And Barclay, you're still on the call. I want to give you a shout out for moderating a phenomenal conversation on public equity market structure. I worked through that last week. We'll package that up, get the video up on YouTube and promote a summary of that. But just terrific job and getting the panelists there. Who did we have? Dr. Demoterin, Rachel Carroll from Russell, and Trevor Graham from TIFF. So just a
very good panelist. It was a good job.
Great insights from that. So look for that in the coming weeks as well. So once again, Mark, thanks so much for your time, sharing your insights. Jim, thanks as well. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Well, that we'll sign off, and we'll see you again next time.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.